Okay, I think that we're now live. I just want to welcome everyone from my living room to yours, or to your office, or wherever you are. Just wish you a good morning, afternoon, or evening from all over the world, and just hope you're having a good ISSCR. And I want to welcome you to our early career group leader panel. And so, what I'll do is to give us a small introduction to myself and the topic, kind of go through how you can interact with the panel in our virtual setting, and then we'll go off, and I'll let the panelists introduce themselves. So the typical format for our early career group leader panel, you might hear me refer to it as a luncheon, because usually during our annual meetings, that's exactly what it is. So this is a forum for early career group leaders and PIs, professors, assistant professors, to sit down over lunch with each other and with some of the more senior board members at the ISSCR, and talk about different aspects of being a group leader. And obviously, in the current setting that we're in, the junior investigator committee, of which I'm the chair, co-chair, decided to kind of reinvent this as a virtual panel. And so we asked some of our panelists, who you'll hear from, to really come together. And so maybe I can step back a bit and say that my name is Josh Curry, and I'm an assistant professor and a co-chair for the Junior Investigator Committee. We kind of plan some of these junior early career events for folks during the annual meeting. And so in this forum, what we're going to talk about today, and what we kind of wanted to try to talk about today, was really one of the things that you're least trained for as a group leader, which is how to manage and mentor other people. And in general, what we want to talk about is really how to be a leader that's able to get the most out of the people in your lab, as far as productivity, motivation, and enrichment is kind of our title. And originally, when we had sat down to think about this, the world was a very different place last year. And so we kind of want to have this panel as both kind of a contrast to the way the world was then, but exactly how it is now. So, you might have group members at home, or maybe just starting back into the labs. And so we really want to talk about what are the struggles, what are the strategies for figuring those things out. So, and in general, we're going to talk more about maybe some of the psychological and kind of the mentoring strategies to do that. And so, as a logistical part of this panel, if you want to ask a question to the panelists, what you'll see in your interface is that there will be down at the bottom a button, two kind of thought bubbles overlapping each other, that will have the chat and the questions and answers. And so the chat is there for folks to interact with each other and maybe just say hi. But really, if you want to pose a question, please use that questions and answers part of the interface. And if you type in a question, I'll see it, and we'll try to pose that to the panelists. And if we don't get any questions, then I have some questions here, and we'll try to work through some topics as we go. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to let them introduce themselves and give you a chance to put in some questions. So maybe we can start with Valentina.
Sure, Josh. Thanks so much. My name is Valentina Grekov. I'm a professor at Yale Medical School. I've had my lab for about 11 years now. And I really admire the work that Josh Curry and the rest of the committee is doing, not only in terms of creating a space for this very important conversation, but also for the continuous investment on the young generation within the ISSCR membership. And I wanted to echo what Josh said. He said that we're discussing what we are the least trained for, which is people management. I would argue that is also what we are least praised, rewarded, or incentivized to invest on. And that's why I think it's an important area to discuss.
Okay, Conrad, maybe?
Yeah, sure. Hi. So thanks also, Josh, for doing this. My name is Konrad Hochedlinger. I've started my lab almost 15 years ago here at the Mass General Hospital in Boston, which is part of Harvard Medical School. We are interested in studying mechanisms by which cell identity is established and maintained. And I also look forward to a interactive discussion with this panel and the audience. And I pass on
Hi,
to
and
Joanna.
yeah, thanks, Konrad. My name is Jan Wysocka, also known as Joanna Wysocka, more broadly, and I'm a professor at Stanford. Started my lab a little over 13 years ago. So we're all from the same generations, Konrad, Valentina, and I. And in fact, Valentina was a dear friend when we were postdocs at Rockefeller at the same time. And yeah, I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you for organizing this discussion. And I also look forward to learning from you what are your strategies and ideas. And I think there will be room for that in the chat afterwards, after this discussion. I would really want to hear what are your ideas and strategies for really mentoring and guiding people and, shepherding them to the next stages of their careers.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think part of how we kind of reimagine this event is also to. I don't think anyone has lived through such an event that we're kind of going through right now. So we also do kind of see this as a brainstorming session, and kind of thinking about people in situations that they've never been in before as group leaders and also as trainees. Um, so maybe I can kind of start the discussion, and I think the first kind of question is as we're kind of talking about productivity and managing and mentoring, and this will tie in a little bit to our career panel that we're having for trainees tomorrow, which is really kind of calibrating a definition of success. Um, and so when we think about managing a group and being a group leader, generally we have these uh, internal and maybe external definitions of success. And I think external definitions of success we can all kind of uh, more or less agree on, things like publishing, acquiring funding, being recognized in the community. Um, but I guess I'm wondering for our panelists, how do you calibrate maybe your own internal values of success, which might be different than those external values of success for your group, and how do you calibrate those two things? I think, as Valentina pointed out, mentoring and kind of managing folks is actually not necessarily incentivized very well in a academic uh, sphere. So how do you kind of calibrate maybe some of those internal definitions of success with the external ones?
Do you want me to start, Josh?
Yeah, that'd be great.
For sure. So what you're saying is the tension we all feel between the outcome and the process. So the outcome and the goals that we are rewarded for as postdocs going to PI is getting papers, and papers that can lead to grant and dollars that can support not only our own lab, but the institution as all within direct. We are then transitioning to a system where we have to do that in even more partnership than we were doing before. But I don't think we've been educated on what process can lead to those outcomes in the most fulfilling way for everybody involved. And if you hear shouting, these are my kids in the background. Sorry about that. And so the question is, how can we not only creating a space from the institution that can really make investigators focusing on what is a process that allows for understanding how to bring every talent that we are surrounded by to their maximum potential, so that those outcomes not only are going to be happening with even a higher frequency per lab members that we have. And one thing we don't do enough in academia is to use tools that are already available for many other jobs. For instance, when I was comparing my own experience to colleagues in Novartis, they always utilize training, mentorship training for junior PI starting their lab. As I started, I also found people that thought alike with respect to we have no skills for management. How can we actually build an understanding of what it means guiding others towards outcome we want? And we started to realize that we really need to tap into other disciplines like organizational psychology. That is really a psychology that helps us not only understanding lab members in the individual relationship PI, but also in the context of a group, of an organization, so that the culture we envision that is going to lead to a process that leads to success is going to be a culture and a process that can support everyone in a win-win situation.
Yes, maybe I can add here. If I understand the question correctly, Josh, how is success defined in the lab internally? I think a very important aspect of success within the lab is to identify an important question, and I'm trying to teach my guys in the lab to find an important question, and that's exciting to both them and to me as the PI, to learn to develop the right tools to address this question in a rigorous way, and then obviously execute on the question by doing experiments. And in the end, I think a key aspect of success is to publish a paper, and it's therefore very important to learn how to tell a story that is cohesive and coherent. And I think those are all the key aspects of success within the lab, which then obviously translate into external perceptions of success, that is publishing a paper, receiving a grant, and so forth. And so those are, I think, the aspects that I try to convey to the guys in my lab to become successful.
So if I can add a little bit to this, so for me, I think broadly, my internal measure of success is really what will be our lab's impact on science in the long term. Meaning, what rigorous and unique science can we produce that will actually, stand the test of time, will have a long-term impact on the field. And then, through that, I realized that the biggest, just the papers, we're always going to be the next paper and we're all, stressed about it, etc. But the biggest long-term impact my lab can have is through the people we train. And therefore, it's sort of a part of the definition of success is to train the next generation of scientists in a way that will really, prepare them to move on to their independent careers. And it really, I think that it's I consider my success, that essentially, I think the biggest part of the legacy we can all produce is going to be not through this next year's paper, but it's really going to be through the impact we had by training people. And not only the people who will go on and have illustrious careers in academia and then will amplify certain ideas and etc., but also people that will go on to other areas, science policy, etc. I feel that in many aspects of society, we need people who've been rigorously trained in scientific method, rigorously trained in critically evaluating, data and facts. And I feel that, the biggest measure of my success is really going to be my impact on people in the lab and on the day-to-day. I think I often tell people that on a day-to-day basis is success is if you go home every day a little wiser. Meaning, can you think ahead in designing the experiment or the next step in your experiment or analysis that no matter what the result is going to be, whether positive or negative, you're going to actually be a step closer to answering the question you're after. And if that's the case, then that defines success. Because even if it's a negative result, even if it disproves your favorite hypothesis, it's still a success. It brings you closer to where you want to be. So on, I guess, the smaller scale, that's success too.
Yeah, I think that's great. So if I can synthesize kind of everybody's answers and maybe try to lead to the next one is that kind of how do you, if you're a new PI starting up, how do you kind of establish a culture where you are, as Conrad said, kind of having people dig into to finding the most interesting questions, finding good questions. How do you, as Joanna said, kind of have a culture where people are wanting to leave every day being a little bit wiser, that that's their goal, and I think Valentina brought up the idea of culture. So kind of how do you start to establish some of those things in your lab, if it's maybe just you and one other student starting, or something to that degree? How do you start to build in, are there clear-cut ways that you can build in that kind of culture, or just in general the culture of your lab?
Shall I go, Josh?
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's an everyday, every moment choice. I mean, Joanna beautifully spell out, for instance, even the way you ask question and in a project can be very powerful if thinking about going about that question in ways that is irrespective of the results, that result can be utilized to move forward. Similarly, in any interaction with anybody, whether it's an NO1 or multiple lab members, how do you go about reestablishing the values that you believe into? So, for instance, one thing we've done when we started is to really figure out what is a process by which we can create a culture of respect where all thoughts are equal, where, of course, people that have been maybe in the field a bit longer, say me as a PI, as an idea and intuition for areas that are much more worthwhile investing because maybe they are unexplored or they provide more novelty in principle, but where the partnership is equal in the sense that is about evolving both minds at the same time. So even if it's an NO1, even if it's a single lab member, how do you go about having those conversations in the office, in the lab, in ways that can make sure that everyone is seen and heard and evolved? Doesn't mean that if there are mistakes or things to learn, that one shies away from it. But how can it be done in a way that doesn't diminish people's self-confidence, people's self-perception? Because once you start to build a culture where everybody's empowered, there is no limit to success. Essentially, you're generating a legacy of people that will go on and be able to make decisions on their feet by understanding that behaviors can be learned as long as one figures out what are the important values that we all share that needs to be invested on.
Yeah, I agree with what Valentina said. I think there are several different aspects of creating a positive lab culture, not just one single rule. In my lab, what works well is I typically assign one project to one individual, and that helps in that individual will become the expert in a certain question or problem in the lab. But it also avoids overlap with other folks in the lab. And that facilitates or enables people to volunteer their opinions and speak very freely, help out each other without sort of feeling that anyone steps on their toes. I also encourage my guys, in addition to having their own main project, to engage in collaborative projects, side projects, in case the main project doesn't go well and or if there's a long waiting period. And that helps to learn to collaborate with others in the lab and learn somebody else's perspective, which helps with a positive lab culture. As Valentina said, discussion is very important and mutual respect. And so for me, I would say lab meetings are the most important aspect of a positive lab culture. For me, this is not just data presentation, passive passively, but it's more of a discussion forum where I expect everyone to chime in and freely express their opinions. And that requires there to be an environment that allows that to occur without sort of being afraid to speak up their mind and so forth. And so that actually has been a great experience where I usually take the back seat and let my folks discuss results and be critical of one another. The last thing I would say is I have a rather small lab, so I have an open door policy. Whenever anyone has a question, whether it's scientific or personal, they can knock on my door and talk to me. And I will always try to make time, unless I'm really busy writing a grant, and discuss issues with them. So I think it's a combination of those things that, in my view, helps establish and maintain a positive lab culture.
So I think a lot of things have already been said. Similarly, as Conrad, I think that giving people true ownerships of their project and having them, empowering them to truly lead that area of investigation in the lab, it really helps in establishing the healthy culture. Of course, there's issue of recruitment, of how do you pick people for your lab, and we can perhaps discuss this later. I think that also is an extremely important component for establishing a lab culture. Into what are your criteria for bringing in people. It's important to. I always tell people who are just starting that it's important to set up this first epigenetic imprint in your lab, and then it will start self-propagating itself. But I feel it's very ground, be in the lab and be active participant in establishing this lab culture in the first few years. And then, of course, there are always going to be some issues and conflicts, and human nature sometimes is to avoid confrontation, and definitely it can be difficult. But from my experience, actually, it's best to deal with any these kind of situations of conflict like that. The faster, the better. Have it, obviously with transparency and with respect, but try to resolve any issues with people involved as soon as you can through open discussion. This is some tension between two lab members, getting them together with you and discussing things and going over through things. The faster the better, because then people can start, imagining things that are not there. The faster you can get them to talk to each other and deal with the issue, the best for the whole culture of the lab. So yes, basically start from recruiting and think about how you recruit people, then empower them to do things and be in the driving seat of their project, and then if there are issues, then try to resolve them as fast as you can.
I think that's great. So, I mean, I've heard this kind of batted around. Like, I think some people are kind of passive about maybe their lab culture, and how intentional do you need to be about some of the things that you put in place? Do you have a code of conduct or values, or and I think that's a really good point about conflict. How do you find out about those things? I've heard some of my PI friends talking about they had no idea that there was a huge conflict in the lab until 6 months later, and somebody was getting ready to quit. And how intentional do you need to be about some of these things when you feel like your goal should be really to do science, as opposed to settling conflict.
I think what you said, Josh, is a big. Oh, sorry, Karan, do you want to go?
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to underscore what you said, Josh. I think there is a false dichotomy that we are taught that science has nothing to do with the scientist. I find that the more we can try to create a culture institutionally, because I think we are all within a culture of an institution, right? But institutionally, the more the university, the institutes, and so on can reinforce that to do the most exciting science, the most creative science, you need to invest and nourish the scientists, their identity, the social pressure on which they operate. And there are questions here on the chat that speak about parenting, for instance. Others could be, you taking care of family members. It doesn't have to be just children. The way you've been socialized based on the country you come, on the religion that you profess, and so on. All of that are part of how we bring our point of view to science. But we tend to dehumanize science. We tend to see it as an objective way to go about discovering nature. And I think that sooner we can be given the chance to understand that we are all subjective. All we have to bring is our point of view based on the collection of experiences we have made, on the education and resources we've been lucky to encounter on the way. And because of that, making the best contribution we can by obeying to certain standards, rigor, accuracy, trying to always turn in the edge and looking for things that are unknown. I think the more we can go and focus on the scientists, I think the more the science will be that robust, will be that innovative, and will really change the way that we think about nature and medicine.
Just wanted to add to this discussion upon point about conflict solution and mentoring trainees. This is something that none of us, or very few of us, are really prepared during our PhD and postdoc, and then all of a sudden we're faced with this situation where we have students, undergrads, postdocs. One of the things that I think was very important to learn from me as I started my lab was that every person in the lab is different. And so the assumption for an outsider might be, when you start your lab, you have a lot of individuals that works and think similarly, and you always compare them to yourself when you were a trainee, which is wrong. And learning the strengths and weaknesses of each individual, I think, is an important aspect of starting a lab, and then sort of capitalize on that. And if there are weaknesses, sort of try to help those individuals to overcome those weaknesses specifically. With respect to conflict resolution, one of the things I did early on was try to get involved in every conflict and try to sort of solve it. And as I have been running my lab for a little longer, it has been helpful to first try to ask the involved parties to solve the conflict by themselves. And only if that doesn't work, I do get involved. Because we're all adults, and adults should be able to resolve conflicts. And that has been another important lesson for me that I learned as I started the lab.
Yeah, I think there is certain trust that you need to establish with the lab members, and then they will be comfortable with to come to you and mention issues that may arise. And yeah, I agree with Conrad. Sometimes the advice will be how this person can solve the conflict themselves without, the moment PI gets involved, or obviously sometimes the situation maybe get escalated to the next level. But sometimes it's just advice of how a person in the lab can resolve. But I think the issue of trust is really important.
So maybe to kind of segue a little bit onto Joanna's point about talking about recruiting and thinking about bringing people into your lab that hopefully will not have as many conflicts, or will be kind of good team members. So a couple people have asked questions about tips for recruiting student or recruiting folks to your lab, and are there certain values that you look for And I think a third point that I think is really important is how do you, I think Conrad pointed to this, that as group leaders, there's kind of a self-selection, a bit of a survivorship going on, that many people that you have in your lab won't respond or act like you. They won't, we're all very different. So how do you build in not only maybe diverse points of view, but also just diverse folks into your lab?
Shall I go, Josh?
Yeah, anybody who wants to take it.
Sure. So what we are tackling now is what are, I guess, tools we use for recruitment, and how do we embrace diversity when different from the points of view that we bring. And one thing I wanted to start from is the idea that so hiring is extremely important, because you want to figure out whether the people that you're interacting with have shared values with you in starting a journey as they join your lab. I just would like to resist the notion that there are troublemakers. I have observed multiple times that people that may make noise or that may sound really loud or create conflicts are often responding to a social or scientific construct that doesn't serve everyone. It may be too much of a generalization, but if we start from a point of view that we might be part of the problem, take for instance gender inequity or sexual orientation. We're not tailoring to everybody in our scientific industry, certainly not in society. So I would like just to refrain from thinking that there are troublemakers out there, but certainly there could be values that you want to consider when looking for people. And so the value I invest on is that everyone has an opinion in that hiring. I know in the chat, Andrea, for instance, brings up how do you do when you have a small lab. So right now my lab is a certain size, and they can help me in the recruitment and thinking, how is this person interfacing with the values we already have and interfacing with everyone in the lab. But at the beginning, I involved people that were colleagues or students and postdocs or staff members in other labs. They came with me to the talks. They allowed me to lend their point of view when I was screening for who would be the next student, postdoc, or staff in my lab. And those values for me are values where I wanted to make sure these people were interested in me and in my lab. So I would ask even prior to the interview, what would you imagine you would like to do in my lab? I wanted to understand whether they were actually having read any of my work, or they were coming because of an institution, for instance, that I was endorsed by. The other is I wanted to see how they thought on their feet, and how do they communicate those ideas. It was a value for me to think that communication is an important aspect of how we come together to discuss science. And the other, I wanted to see during the interview for an entire day, how do they respond to everyone across the power level. I would be the person hiring, and so as an employer, I would have a power differential that they would be responding to. But how do they respond to, say, if it's postdoc position, to an undergraduate, to an admin, to a janitor? I'm really interested to understand in people 360 degrees perspective and respectful approach, top and bottom. And so those are values that I consider when hiring people.
Yeah, I second everything that Valentina said. For me, I would say three points are key for selecting a new person into the lab. Number one is personality. So the person that I consider has to fit into the lab, and I usually, when I interview somebody, I have everyone in the lab talk to them, and then I ask my folks what they think about that person, and only if there's agreement about that person, as Valentina said, would I go ahead and make an offer. But in addition, I obviously ask that person whether he or she is excited about what we do and why they chose my lab as opposed to another lab. And the answer should not just be publication record or I read on your website this or that. There should be some more specific justification of why they picked our lab as opposed to another lab. But personality really is key, and motivation and drive, I think, is key to to make a decision. The second thing is publication record, for postdocs at least. For graduate students, obviously this doesn't matter. Is a sort of metric of whether that person is able to work and think scientifically and execute. And it doesn't matter so much what the impact factor of the publication is, rather than being able to show that he or she can think and execute scientifically. And the last thing I'm looking for in a new candidate is somebody who has skill sets or a background that is somewhat complementary to what we are doing in the lab. So I rarely hire people who have done exactly the same as we do, because I like bringing in people who have either different technology or different biological assay or a different way of thinking about problems, which we then merge with our lab, and that often leads into new scientific directions, which is important for me. So it's a combination of those three things that I look for when I make new hires.
For me, hiring is always a person-based, not necessarily that, oh, we have this project and I'm looking for person familiar with this technology, so they can go and execute it. I think that you really should assume that the person is motivated and talented. They can learn any technique. So really, you wanna bring people who have that motivation, who have the drive, who have the interest in science that you do. And then, of course, is the question of, as it's already been mentioned, personality fit with the lab. I also give my lab a veto power with any hire. So even if I'm excited about the person, for them they feel there are some red flags, they have a veto power for bringing anyone in the lab. However, I should also say that we almost always agree, actually, in many instances. And I also look for people who think about problems in different ways that we have approached the problems so far. So again, this gives rise to a more enriching environment. So yeah, I guess these are the main criteria. But yeah, the person, the talented, motivated person interested in our work comes first, and everything else comes second.
Yeah. Can I add one thing, Josh? So when interviewing postdocs, this is obviously much more challenging because you meet that person only for a day or half a day sometimes, and compared to a student who rotates in the lab for a month or longer, where you really learn the personality and people interact much more. And so I think it's really important what Valentina said, that if you're a junior lab with no lab members yet, ask other people on the floor in your department to sit in at the seminar, or ask those individuals to meet this candidate. And the other thing I would add is call up the references. Don't just rely on the letters that you get, and get another perspective over the phone or in person from previous mentors of that individual. And if you do those things together, the chance is much higher that the person that you get is really who you think it is and fits into the lab.
And once the lab gets a little bigger, they're going to be your best recruitment and interview tool. I mean, it's amazing that the members of my lab can find out during a postdoc interview the information that I probably would have never been able to either notice because I'm oblivious or find out. So they essentially involve your lab members as much as possible in recruitment.
I think that's great advice. We had a few questions related to maybe you have a few people in your lab now, but I think Conrad pointed out that his lab meetings are kind of where he tries to establish some of the lab culture about having discussion and folks being able to speak up and having their opinions being heard and valued. But if you have a small group, sometimes it's hard to encourage people to make those kinds of uh, to kind of express themselves in that way. You know, if you have new students, maybe they feel shy or they're not sure about joining in a conversation. And so, how do you really encourage? Are there intentional things that you can do, or how do you encourage folks to participate and kind of be involved in discussions, papers, and journal clubs and things like that? Maybe I can direct it to you, Conrad, since
Sure. So I'm very understanding of this situation, because when I was an undergrad and even a graduate student, I was rather timid and wouldn't speak up right away. And so what I try to do is I give every member of the lab, and that includes undergraduate students, graduate students, postdocs, obviously, the opportunity to present journal clubs, which can be frightening a little bit if you're a junior trainee, but it's an opportunity to learn to present a paper, defend a paper, engage in a discussion with the group, receive criticism and defend it or agree with criticism. And the same is true for lab meetings. So undergrads, grad students, postdocs all present at lab meetings. And over time, it takes some time to warm up, obviously, and to get to know each other. But over time, people do feel more confident and comfortable, I should say, to speak up and ask questions. Even if some of the questions don't make the most sense, they speak up. And the importance, again, is to generate an environment where every opinion is respected, and people don't talk down on more junior trainees or say, yeah, why are you asking this sort of silly question? As long as you as a PI ensure that this happens, over time, people will engage more in these discussions, and this helps the lab culture and lab environment, in my view.
Joanna or Valentina, did you have
anything? Once people are used to speaking up, then the culture, again, this epigenetic imprint is established, and the next person coming to the lab sort of walks into the culture in which people speak up, lab meetings, argue about science, etc. It's the biggest challenge is to really encourage people to do this from the beginning and sort of keep working on it to really have people more involved in the discussion.
Yeah, to me, it resonates also what Jessica is saying. How do you make it to be their own need and their own inspiration to do that, as opposed to being mandatory? And what do we mean by shy? So Conrad, I think, was operating under the hypothesis and diagnosis that people may feel threatened by the presence of others. And Joanna is offering the fact that if the culture of the environment is really the one to ask questions, that might level the playing field. Also think that there will be some people that may just inherently be more silent, and they like to offer feedback afterwards. So to me, it always stems from how do you understand that lab member in the context of that culture, and could it be alternative way where they can still speak up and contribute by ways that is more comfortable for them. Corrado was saying when he was a student, he was having trouble sometimes to ask a question. I find myself, depending on the environment at conference, I would actually never ask a question in group settings. I feel intimidated and feel always stupid. So I actually always opt for going one-to-one and navigate those interactions in a more private settings, just because I often think my ideas are not often very easy even to explain. So I just think that if we can understand why and how people are inhibited in the lab, and we can go in tailored tools as well as culture that supports that discussion, it may be a better way to make everyone thrive.
Yeah, we did have a few people pose questions where they were actually having like a joint lab meeting with a larger group, or some kind of journal club with another group. And so I definitely hear what you're saying, maybe about different types of spaces and cultures that trainees might find themselves in, and how, you know, maybe learning how to gaining confidence, or feeling that certain venues are safer or easier to ask questions than others.
Exactly, and often it goes by.
Joanna, do you
No,
want
go ahead, Valentina.
So sorry, Joanna. So I just
Yeah,
wanted to
so I was.
All right, I'll be very quick. So I guess the last point I wanted to make is that sometime also, especially in the beginning of my lab, I knew that, for instance, my student had a good idea about it, or she had done something in her project, be connecting, and I knew she was thinking about it. And so I would gently bring it up to the audience, not by putting her on the spot, but by saying, so and so has seen that, and in fact, when we saw that together, we thought immediately of your project, and so that would be something that could reconcile the two different observations. So, kind of showing people that may be younger in their training what would be the language you could use to make points that I think they were thinking because of prior discussion, so that they would have an easier time to utilize in the next lab meetings.
Also, what I sometimes do at lab meetings, I sort of encourage feedback from people, which is, say, somebody's presenting some data, and maybe I would offer, some interpretation and possible next steps, but then I would say, but what do you guys think? Should we think of X or Y or Z? What would be a better approach, and why? Or I would say, this is my interpretation, but you think, what are other possibilities here? And that helps when it's, a state question, but it's not necessarily pointed at one person. It helps open up a discussion.
I agree. The other thing I would say is I actually sometimes say, going back to the question about shy or quiet or silent people, I actually sometimes say, including on Zoom calls at lab meeting, if somebody wants to share their view or opinion with me offline, they can do so. And some people in the lab actually take advantage of that because they either don't want to feel comfortable mentioning it in front of the entire group, or they don't want to offend somebody else in the lab. And so that's another way to for people to express themselves and share their opinions with you as a PI, rather than keeping it for themselves.
Yeah, I think those are great points. I have to say, I don't think on my feet very well. So I know other folks that don't either. So I realize that sometimes even having the time to process a thought or question actually is a big part of that. So yeah, I think as Valentina pointed out, the psychology and just kind of the differences between us, they need some of these different outlets. So kind of in thinking of in thinking about training and in culture, so what are some of the strategies that y'all use to build in some of these kind of maybe kind of less obvious skills, things like resilience and kind of persistence? I think those are things that we can talk about maybe in the way that the world was a year ago versus maybe the way the world is today. I don't know if anybody wants to volunteer or.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So I think an important consideration is to make people feel comfortable or feel supported by you as the PI and by your department. And an important aspect of that is communication. So we are all flooded by emails from our department chairs and institutions and universities about the crisis, the COVID crisis, and that can be confusing and frightening. What I try to do is once a week during our Zoom lab meetings is extract the key information that I hear from the leadership that is relevant for the lab, and convey that to my folks, and try to make them feel safer that way, or at least clarify some of the uncertainties that are out there as it relates to reopening the lab and maintain a healthy perspective and so forth. But then I think we also just have to accept that time was lost during this crisis, and we can't just make up for it by working 24/7 once the labs reopen. So we have to move forward, obviously, but it has to be done in a thoughtful and careful way. And I think emphasizing this at the level of the PI is important to maintain this healthy perspective in the lab.
Yeah, maybe I can continue on that. I think it refers to a point that we were discussing before, also conflict, vulnerability. Melissa Little was writing on the chat. And by the way, Yona, your cat has been admired in the chat as well. So Melissa was saying, I always take a pulse on the lab. I try to understand things as they happen. And like Liana was saying, intervene immediately. The same is here. I totally agree with Corin that we need to have a firm presence from the top that can be succinct and provide a guideline that is not overwhelming. At the same time, if one can create a system where it can welcome any anxiety as they happen, and if people really are heard, and my actions show my commitment to hearing them and addressing it, that's how I think they can feel validated in what they're experiencing, which is all legit. I mean, we are all really not knowing how to go about this craziness. But also we can much more quickly overcome this sense of inadequateness, of overwhelming and frustration, and start to build the resilience. So again, here I find that if we were to go and say there are people that are resilient versus not, I think we will be making a mistake. I think that while there may be degree of behaviors that we come to based on our experiences, there is also a culture in the lab that can provide a much easier ability to adapt and be resilient, as long as we are heard in fundamental needs. And so one thing that, for instance, we have done has been always trying, as we had to shut down the lab, is to have these continuous organizational meetings once a week to discuss where we stood, what were the problem, and so on. And I realized very quickly that I was actually screwing it up because people were not capable immediately of adapting to have conversation that were of this difficulty, standing on their feet and just discussing in front of a video. I learned a lot by asking them, what am I doing wrong? Why can we have a conversation like we used to do? And they guide me, they give me tools. They allow me to now understand that the medium doesn't allow for us to have conversation like we used to, and for me to be able to bring them there. They educated me to create an agenda that they will be also active participant in creating it. They will be delivered the day before, so that they will have time to think about it, so that when we come all together, we can have the same time of conversation, open, transparent, and fruitful as we used to. So again, I think one can build the resilience, one can build the ability to overcome struggle when tailoring to the people that we lead, when we really listen to them and we value their perspective.
I feel that, certain level of anxiety and vulnerability is quite warranted in these times. And it's also important to recognize that, different people will have, different issues. So for example, There were some lab members that I was worried about because of the social isolation, who I knew that they are living alone and were not able to really, don't have any close family, etc. That essentially, when we were in shutdown, that the social isolation will actually be a huge issue here. There are other lab members who have two kids. They need to homeschool, and their spouse is an essential worker. And there, now that we're coming back, of course, they again have different set of issues that we have to think about and try to accommodate, let's say, through the comeback, their work schedule, so they can juggle all this responsibility while feeling that their projects can also move forward. There are postdocs who are in their senior years who were ready to move on or are getting ready to move on next fall, and there's certain level of anxiety associated with revision of their papers and the job market, etc. And that also needs to be again individually mitigated, perhaps through ensuring them that there will be this buffer time we can give them if they need to stay an extra year, because we all don't know how the job market is going to look next year, etc., etc. So yes, I mean, these are not. This is not lack of perspective. I think these are real issues that we need to talk about with our lab members and try to mitigate as much as we can for them.
Yeah, I think those are great points. Just to acknowledge that there are real anxieties and problems, and I realize that kind of the space that we're in now with the pandemic, it really seems to have amplified very real issues that many people were having. And as Joanna pointed out, on very opposite ends of the spectrum. I did have friends that were going to stir crazy, whereas being at home with a child, I had a completely different perspective that was also, very, very hard to deal with. So I think that's very true, just to acknowledge and validate what people in your lab are feeling, and to try to just help give them some perspective, but also acknowledging that those are very real issues that they have.
I mean, the intersectionality also of both different reaction at the individual level, as well as in the aftermath of all the different groups that we belong to. Because I find that the moments of crisis legitimize the racism we all carry, legitimize all the really terrible things that we are brainwashed with since we are born. And so, for instance, the pandemic, I bet is going to mean very different things for a person that carries my color of skin versus someone who happens to have Asian traits. I've seen it firsthand, but I cannot imagine how stressful it must have been for some of my lab members, just because they happen to have Asian traits, or some that actually have families in China who has been going through this for very early on, November and December. And so while for us it's been just a couple of months, for these individuals it's been several months of stress, thinking about their parents are thinking about them. And also the pandemic in the context of all these immigrant issues of visa. I mean, as an immigrant myself, I am in pain every single day, reflecting on the continuous damage and loss of talent. I mean, 100% of our papers are signed by immigrants because I'm an immigrant myself. And more than 60% have a first author that is an immigrant. And the diversity and impactfulness of science is really determined heavily by this ability of bringing different points of view. So it's not only the pandemic, it's what the crisis does in all of us, legitimizing all the dirt that we carry, I'm included, as well as all these other conditions that make the anxiety just a constant.
So I think I think that's very well said. I don't have anything to add to that. Just kind of thinking about, are there ways that we can address this as group leaders? And are there ways? I think that it's difficult to view your lab as kind of support for one another, but at the same time, it is still kind of like a work environment that can have added stress that goes along with it. So how do you, especially when we're doing a lot of things remotely, how do you kind of balance those two things to offer support, but still kind of recognize that um, folks are not at 100% necessarily right now? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. So if I understood the question correctly, so if in academic science, there's always been ups and downs, obviously, and in terms of funding, in terms of exciting science going on in your lab, in terms of job market and so forth. But what the COVID crisis has taken it to another level and has underscored, I think, the importance of diversifying in the lab to mitigate some of the risks and keep the lab going. And when I say diversifying, I mean diversifying at many levels, at the level of having high risk and low risk projects in the lab to sort of have some balance and buffering. Ideally, have some senior and more junior trainees who complement each other and can help out each other in this situation. But also in diversifying in the context of funding, given the uncertainty of how NIH will continue to fund our research, looking into the possibility of philanthropy or industry money, or maybe institutional money if that's available. So I think diversifying might at least help to buffer some of the risks of this crisis, but also future crises that we might face after this.
So for folks, maybe to pose this back to you, Conrad. So for folks that are just starting, how do you you're coming in with a clear idea that you were kind of hired to do something, and how do you build some of that? I would say maybe research program resilience is kind of what you're talking about, like group resilience, um, into what you're doing now. What can somebody who's just starting kind of maybe do to kind of work on that?
I mean, also one thing that I'm sure that a lot of junior PIs that are starting now are really anxious about the fact that they have not been able to make as much progress in setting up their lab, getting the project going, recruiting people as they think. I mean, many institutions, and I hope most institutions, I would like to hear if that's not the case, actually extended the tenure clock because of the pandemic. At Stanford, for example, there's an optional extension of the tenure clock by 1 year. And the junior people that I talked to advise them, I actually told them to take that year. You don't have to use it, but it will really be nice to have this a little bit extra buffer of time, because yes, there will be time lost because of all of this. If your institution doesn't have it, then perhaps it should. So maybe it should be made aware that many other peer institutions are thinking about it and implementing such changes. So, yeah, I mean, there are also some that done, I guess, at the institutional level to help junior faculty, to help shepherd the junior faculty through this crisis and potential loss of time. And I think the impact on the tenure clock is one that really needs to be mitigated.
So we had a number of questions from folks that were kind of asking about, I guess, dividing time as far as, and that's something that was not necessarily what our subject was to talk about, but I think this is important, maybe in this moment now, where folks are kind of wondering, maybe they have additional downtime, maybe they're just getting their labs back up and running, and they're already junior PIs that are maybe trying to balance between the amount of work they do in the lab versus the amount of work that they might be doing to write grants or papers. So, what would be your advice for folks that are just starting out and kind of trying to wonder how to balance the time that they're spending right now?
So, I mean, it certainly provided. So the problem is that even when you're working from home, depending what's your situation at home, you might not be able really to focus, right? So we're speaking about an ideal that maybe many of us don't have. And even if you don't have kids to attend, you might feel anxious. So let's take it with a grain of salt, anything I'm going to say. But provided you have an opportunity to get distracted by doing your science, whatever task it is, certainly there is an opportunity as a starting PI to get to your writing muscle up. So one of my postdocs actually left and started with almost in parallel to COVID in January in Samboom Park. And so Samboom has been working at this R01 and eliciting actually the interaction within his department as a way to learn how to write effectively that grant, how to make sure that his colleagues even knew more of what he was doing, and even recruiting a rotation students by doing analysis. So one thing could it be that a writing opportunity may be combined to this period, provided you can stay sane and you have a space home to do it. The other thing is that, and this may again be taken with a grain of salt, we all assume we are speaking to people that have been highly supported by their former PI. And one thing we always joke in my lab before the pandemic is that we will be able to put together multiple papers by stopping all experiments, because as an attitude, we tend to do more experiments than we do analysis. And so I guess my curse became reality, because we actually had to stop to do all experiments, and we spent the past 2-3 months analyzing data. And in reality, because we have always some amount of data in excess, and if your PI has done the right job to relinquish much of what you have done and beyond, there could be an opportunity for rethinking about the data that you brought with you to start your own lab and then utilizing it. And the third aspect is really your community, either the past or the present, ways of coming together, even in creating forums that allow you to either generate collaboration that utilize what you already have, or other aspects may be a way to evolve on the spot, ways to withstand, survive, and create new bonding. But I'm not just pretending that this is easy. And again, if your chemistry is such that you're anxious and you have a lot in your mind, what I'm saying is quite insulting.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think there's an all-size-fits-all solution. It's very individual based, but I've actually done in my lab something similar to Valentina did. I asked my folks to basically put together the data they've generated over the last 6 months, as if they had to publish a paper, even with an early project, just to keep them engaged, but also I think we do this too little. Synthesize the data in a format that almost looks like a figure, but isn't yet ready for a paper. And once you go through these data, you actually think differently about some projects or about experiments that you should have been doing and might want to do once the labs reopen. And it helps to then have a better focus on what are really the key experiments once you can get back to the lab. And you might make up for some of the time that is lost. On the other hand, you might use some of these figures or figure-like panels for grants to write. So I think this is a win-win situation if that is warranted for the individual in the lab.
So for us, we actually, for my lab during the closure, we actually switched formats of our lab meetings into the what we call big picture lab meetings. So instead of presenting data that were just recently generated and everybody feeling pressure that they need to show new data, I actually asked everyone to step back and really think about the big picture of their project and trying to put it in the context of what has been done in the field, or where the field is going, and big questions that they think their projects will address, etc., etc. And I think that was quite useful exercise. And now that we're reopening, we're switching the lab meeting format again from our regular one into the shorter format of discussing the highest priority experiments that the lab members will do when they'll be able to, or when they're getting back. And this is really to provide a timely feedback, and with 3-4 people presenting every lab meeting in this format, providing timely feedback and helping people prioritize, since each of them will only have 4 hours of lab work a day, which things are truly the most important next steps to do for their project. But I also think the question, if I understood correctly, was also generally how the young PIs divides their time between lab work and writing grants and all of this. And it's very challenging. I stopped personally doing experiments when I realized that I'm setting a bad example for my lab members, because I would walk away from a gel that the proteins run out a long time, and because I got stuck at the faculty meeting, and then I thought, well, this is really setting a bad example. And then I realized that it will be very difficult for me to juggle doing experiments myself, and that perhaps that more and more limited time that I have will be better spent analyzing and helping design and discussing results with the lab members. So this sort of shift, at some point will come naturally, but I would still maintain that it's important for the PI to be in the lab for this first couple of years, or as long as they can.
Yeah, I think that's great. I've definitely learned do as I say, not as I do when it comes to bench work. My proficiency has definitely gone down over time. So kind of in that vein, kind of also thinking about mentoring within the lab, that you are not the only manager or mentor in the lab. What are some key things that you can do to I think we've already talked about kind of making a culture where everybody's input's valid and everybody is kind of on equal footing when it comes to discussion. But how do you actually build in mentoring into the lab where folks can mentor each other, or if you have a postdoc interacting with students and things like that, how can you have those senior lab members that are actually still good at bench work informing and mentoring? So do you formalize mentoring relationships, or do you kind of keep that more informal? I don't know if anybody wants to start.
I'm happy to start. So I usually team up new lab members with senior lab members, and that's always based on both project and personality. And very often this actually leads then to a joint publication where the new trainee learns a lot from the more senior person, gets a co-authorship on the paper, and then sort of passes on the buck to the next generation of trainees. And that has worked out for the most part well in my lab. And this is more important, obviously, for students than for postdocs, but even for junior postdocs, it can be helpful actually to team them up with a more senior person, especially if it's somebody from a different field with a different background, and that works well in our lab.
Yeah, I guess what Coran is saying is twofold, right? Is one, how do we pose ourselves as mentors in the lab with respect to the trainees? So trainee to trainee or staff to trainee and vice versa. And also, how do we do joint synergy, joint collaboration to then lead to an outcome that can help everybody's career advancement of the CV? For the last part, I think what really brings up an important constraint to consider is also how scientific enterprise value first author, and also first author that is first listed. I've been really having a lot of conversation, especially with journal editors and many colleagues, of a culture that does reinforce the individual and single genius solo journey. And yet science is moving into being more and more collaborative. So if the metric is always say Greco et al., it doesn't matter if there are two or three other equally important authors, those people won't be cited in most of the journals because the reference doesn't pick them up. And it creates a huge motivation for this type of collaboration, for joint effort. When they are within the bubble of the lab, they may be very excited, but they know that the reality outside may be different. Now, there are all sorts of things that have been done in the CV. You can expand the contribution in your letter. You can say, but there is also part of recognition that we won't be able to satisfy in the current system. And I think this is a flaw. And the other aspect is how do we incentivize, train, and make people feel rewarded of mentoring each other in the lab? And I think everyone, if you were to ask, would say, would you be happy to think that people are happy with you, that they can learn from you, for sure. But there is also a tension of time management, right? Like I'm investing on you so that one day, hopefully, together we'll see a product that we feel satisfied. How do you make sure that people start that journey without a promise of a product, just because it's part of the relationship that you need to build, part of the training? And that's where I think you need to have a big support system to make sure people start to latch on what is the experience like for the other. We are very much focused, rightfully so, on our vulnerability. But much less often we think about how is the other thinking, how is the other experiencing this, and how can my weaknesses be matched by your strengths and your weaknesses be matched by my strengths in a way that is complementary. But again, we go against culture. We don't have a culture in science that is collaborative. There is a single winner often for any award. It's not there is a group of winners. We don't reward collaborative projects. So I find that there is a tension between what we try to do and what society keeps telling us.
Joanna, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
I'm not sure I have anything valuable to add at this point. I think the key points have been made.
But yeah, I totally echo what Valentina said, and I think it's also something that I've been challenged to do is when thinking about training, that we're training students or postdocs in the lab, that setting a clear expectation of what the metrics or the outcomes that we want from people in their training. We want them to be good scientists. We want them to think critically, but at the beginning of this discussion, we just talked about how we're never trained to mentor or manage. So actually having that as a clear outcome or expectation for trainees in the lab, that, it's part of your training is to learn how to collaborate, to mentor, to work with other people, I think is important. And it's, at least internally, it's a culture that should recognize that those kinds of interactions are important and they are part of the enterprise that we're in.
And how do you manage that dependence?
But I also think that a lot of our trainees recognize that. I mean, I have a lot of most of my trainees, particularly more senior trainees, they seek out opportunities to mentor. Most of them never interest and understand important part of their training and moving on to the next step.
totally agree. So we're at about 10 minutes from the end of the session, and maybe we had a very kind of broad question from someone just asking, what are your 3 top advices for new group leaders? And so I guess that can be anything from buy a good desk chair to maybe something more philosophical, but maybe we can go in the opposite order, and I can ask Joanna, just what are your 3 top advices for folks that are just starting out or in their first few years?
Don't be afraid to go for the big questions that interest you. So really, take the time and resources to set up areas of investigation in your lab that you really think of, I'm going to spend all this startup, or I need to get a paper quickly. It's really important to take that time and take the resources to go for something that you really meet them. And particularly when it comes to this human component, I think this is, from my personal perspective, this is where I feel I made most mistakes, but hopefully I learned from them, and I still keep learning from them. But that's okay. That's part of the process. Recognize that everybody who will come to work in your lab is a different person, and perhaps different in the work. Yeah, I think this would be the key.
Conrad?
Yeah, so I think people are the most important thing of a laboratory, as Joanna said, and I would also put that as one of the 3 most important things. Connected to that, I would say an advice is not to overhire people. One is, when you get like a nice starter package, you tend to hire or be tempted to hire a lot of postdocs and students at the same time. My advice would be to do this gradually, so you can actually evaluate people and have people then weigh in on new hires rather than put together a bunch of people that you hired independently. The second thing that I feel is important is to focus. Obviously, it's important to have a big question, an important question in mind, but very often, certainly I, when I was a postdoc, enjoyed working on many different projects in parallel and multitask. And I think one might be tempted as a new PI to work on a lot of different things at the same time. But in order to establish yourself and get the first grants and be promoted, it's key to have an impact in a certain area and not just sort of do here and there experiments. And then the third point actually goes back to people having a diverse mix of individuals with different backgrounds, ideally different levels of training. So I always, for the longest time, had a 50-50 mix of students and postdocs. Now it's more postdoc heavy again. But having sort of a spectrum from undergraduate to graduate to postgraduate education just generates an interesting lab culture and dynamics where your trainees can learn to mentor each other, and where the lab culture is elevated to another level. So I think those are the 3 most important things I would give as advice to a new PI.
Yeah, I would second completely what Conrad and Joanna are saying. We live in a culture where science is the focus. So putting at first place a scientist is really the most fundamental shift we need to think about. And I would argue also creating a culture with these scientists where feedback up the hierarchical ladder, which means creating a channel communication that really allows for you people to tell you when you're doing something wrong, when they don't feel hurt, when they feel like you're setting up a system that doesn't allow them to thrive, and have the humility to consider all options. That, I think, is how you can really lead successfully an organization. The second would be training. Facing our shortcomings and the fact that we need continuously practicing both managerial as well as scientific skills is fundamentally important. And finally, I would say that in tailoring the science you do, so if you're given a lab, clearly you have demonstrated the ability to understand and have a taste for scientific novel questions. So I think what you might want to think about is, what is your strategy? What is your process for doing science in ways that is going to allow the innovation while maintaining productivity? How much balance in each project or as a lab, do you create that balance of conservative versus innovative risk taking? And what process do you use to tailor the question in a way that no matter what question you ask and answer, you're going to be able to contribute somewhere to a manuscript that is important. No, I'm not saying important of any specific journal, important meaning a contribution for something we didn't know the answer of.
That's great. Thank you all so much. I think we're at the point where we have to wrap up. So I really want to thank Valentina, Conrad, and Joanna for joining me. Thank you for taking the time to be with us and to share your philosophy and your experiences. And I really appreciate everyone for their questions. And I feel kind of bad because I was only able to glance at the chat and it looked so good. And I feel bad that I wasn't able to participate that much. But I do want to encourage everyone to, we do have a forum, a junior investigator forum. So if you go through the main lobby, I guess, if you go into the main interface, there's a forum for the junior investigator forum. So we're going to try to continue some of the discussion that we've had right now. And I'm looking forward, based on the chat, to meet you there, and maybe going to go grab a beer and then come back and join everyone. So I would definitely like to just point everybody over there, and wherever you are, if you can just give a clap for our panelists. And thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a really great rest of the meeting.